Welcome, friends, to another Global Capitalism, a presentation that we offer every other month, and by we I mean Democracy at Work and the Left Forum. I'm your host, Richard Wolff. The next one, by the way, will happen in November, 2 months from now, immediately after the U.S. election that we will be talking about today. And so we will have commentary now beforehand and then in terms of what happens next, which will probably be, even more important, a question to answer. But before I delve into elections, both here in the United States and three important elections in recent weeks in Britain, France, and Germany, which, by the way, offer us similar lessons, I want to take time out, a few moments, to present to you a summary of a recent presentation that I made at the invitation of King's College in Lagos, Nigeria. It is over 100-year-old. It's actually celebrating its 115th anniversary, and it has an active alumni association, King's College Old Boys, and they kindly and generously invited me to make a presentation as part of their celebration of their 115th anniversary, which I did. And I want to present some of the summary of that to you because it'll give you an insight on a topic that is right behind the headlines every day and right behind much of what we're going to be saying the rest of today in terms of elections, even though it's about another topic. What I want to do is to present to you, summarily, the stark difference between the United States as one kind of country and Nigeria as another. I want to stress the differences, although there are plenty of similarities as well. But the differences are what call for our analysis and attention, and not a little empathy. Here we go. Nigeria population is roughly 220 million people. That makes it one of the larger countries in the world, one of the largest in Africa. A country 2/3 the size of the United States. 2/3. A 50% increase in Nigeria, and you have a country the size of the United States in terms of population. What is the output of goods and services flowing from these 220 million people? And we have a number in economics, the GDP, the gross domestic product, that is a rough measure of the size of an economy in terms of the goods and services it's capable of producing in one calendar year. The GDP most recently of Nigeria was about $500 billion, with a B, billion dollars. The most recent GDP number for the United States is in the neighborhood of $22, $23 trillion. The population of the United States is 50% more than Nigeria, but the output of goods and services is 50 times that of Nigeria. That is a gap in wealth and poverty that ought to make your breath halt in your throat. That is a definition of extreme inequality. The word extreme isn't extreme enough. This country, with 50% more people, enjoys wealth 50 times that of Nigeria. What's worse is that if you look at the inequality inside Nigeria, it's also worse than that in the United States. And the United States has a severe inequality problem. Nigeria's is even worse. A tiny percentage, 1, 2, 3, of the Nigerian population live very well, are very rich, but the rest aren't. The gap inside and the gap outside are hobbling Nigeria and many, many other countries. You can never understand what is going on in the world, as you will see when I conclude today's talk, if you do not keep in mind the gaps I've just described. They are not unique to Nigeria, not at all. I picked Nigeria because it's a very important country. I pick it because I had another occasion to speak to people from the community there. And there is another reason. Nigeria always was a prize for the colonial struggle to grab it. It's surrounded by the colonies or ex-colonies of France and other countries. It was a major achievement of British colonialism. The wealth that was there and taken by the Europeans. Even to this day, Nigeria sits on extraordinary wealth. It's one of the world's major oil producers, and its current situation is a dependence on oil, products derived from raw oil, nitrogen fertilizers made from oil, and so on. It has those resources, and yet it is crippled and hobbled by extreme inequality globally and extreme inequality internally. It is also a tragedy, a country experiencing extraordinary struggles right now over governance, a polite way of saying that a country trapped in the way this country is, Nigeria, provokes sooner or later, and often all the time, conflicts of every kind that arise from or are worsened by this kind of inequality. And remember, it has existed from the time that the British arrived to this moment that I'm speaking with you. It's a backdrop to everything I'm about to say about elections in the United States, Britain, France, and Germany, which may seem far away, but as you'll see, are not. Okay, let's turn then to the first and the most important in the world at this point, which is the elections here in the United States. I am not going to speak about anything other than the two major parties and the two major candidates. Why? Because we live in a system here in the United States which effectively excludes all other political parties. We have those parties, for those who may not know. They run for office as best they can, trying to navigate the endless bureaucratic hoops whose purpose is to make it very difficult for any kind of third, let alone fourth and fifth party to contest nationally. They have agreed, these two parties, to exclude everybody else. We have a duopoly politically. Two. And there's a lot of irony there, which I won't take time to go through, other than to notice that the United States prides itself in many, many forums on the ground that it celebrates, quote, freedom of choice. And yet, when it comes to the political decisions that govern the direction of the country, choice is precisely what we do not have. We do not have freedom of choice. We have an electoral system that is the equivalent of saying to a child, here is a wonderful ice cream store with lots and lots of flavors, and you can pick any one you want as long as it's either chocolate or vanilla. We have lots of political freedoms, and we have freedom of choice so long as we are content to have Republicans and Democrats. And so that's what we do. We have Donald Trump running for president on the Republican side, and Kamala Harris running for president on the Democratic side. Let me begin with the differences that exist between them. There clearly are differences. In frustration, many Americans wave their hands and say, there are no differences. What they mean is that whatever the differences are don't matter to them, which I can understand. But there are differences. Here they are in general, because in general is all that's relevant. The candidates often don't go beyond generalities, and when they do, it's just vague and gestural. This is something I'm going to hopefully do, or this is something I will propose, or this is something I and my party will back. None of which means you're going to get that. It just gives you an idea. So I'm going to give also a general idea. Mr. Trump wants to continue to extend the tax cuts that were the only major economic achievement of his administration when he was president. The tax cut of December 2017, an enormous tax cut chiefly geared towards corporations and the richest individuals. Makes perfect sense. Those are the people who normally favor the Republican Party. This was an achievement to give back to the voters for that party what they had expected to get in exchange for their vote. The Democratic Party is not committed to extending those tax cuts. Now, it gets murky as to which ones they might or might not, and for how long, and in what way, and to what degree. There we get into those details that I could go into, but that don't matter in terms of either what they've said or what they could achieve. But there's a difference. Republicans are more generous with tax cuts for corporations and the rich. The Democrats, let us say, to be honest, are less generous. More likely to give some tax cuts to the middle and lower income, more likely, if they don't give tax cuts, to use more of the money the taxes raise for social programs for middle and low income people than the Republicans. Those are real differences. Very profound in our country this year, the difference over abortion. The Republicans are against allowing women to have abortions, and the Democrats are in favor of allowing women to select and choose abortions. There again, by the way, choice is something the Democrats want the women to have. Republicans, who are normally in favor of choice, have an exception here, no choice. Guns. The Republican Party is generally sympathetic to letting the population have guns, the Democrats less so. Social programs, the Democrats favor more of them, supporting poor people, supporting people discriminated, supporting people in need of one kind or another to get help from the government. The Republican resist all of that, tend to oppose it. Not 100%, but in general, we can say that. And finally, the Democrats are friendly to labor and labor unions, whereas the Republican Party, much less so, much more likely to side with the employer and the capitalists. So those are differences. They're real. They usually show up in legislation and in the battles over legislation. But there are also real similarities between the two parties, and those deserve just as much attention as the differences. So here are some similarities. Both parties are now on record as opposing much of the immigration that has happened in the United States or to the United States in recent years. They're quite similar in promising to be strict, to limit immigration, and so forth. Both parties support Ukraine in the war with Russia. Indeed, the difference between them exists. There are remarks among Republicans questioning the extent of the support, the conditions of the support, but the hostility to Russia goes across both parties, and the Democrats are more enthusiastic in their support for Ukraine than the Republicans in a general way, but they all support the Ukrainians and they are against the Russians. This is even more the case with Israel. The support for Israel is strong among the Democrats, strong among the Republicans. Support for the Palestinians, scarce to zero among Republicans, and small but not zero among the Democrats. But officially, in terms of the political positions, both parties support Israel against Palestine and Ukraine against Russia. Perhaps the closest agreement is on hostility to China. China is perceived as the major threat, short term and long term. China's expansion and growth, frightening. Both parties support economic, military, and other measures that have been taken, that both parties have already endorsed and show no sign of backing away from. And both parties support the extraordinary level of military spending in the United States, as has been documented, among others, by Brown University's research into war and the costs of war. The United States spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined spend on the military, and those other 9 countries include both Russia and China. The rest of them are allies of the United States. And they all agree on that. They don't oppose that. Then there are the things that both parties are silent about, that you will not hear neither Mr. Trump nor Kamala Harris speak about. First, there is grotesque inequality of the United States that has gotten worse over the last 40 years, almost without interruption. The United States is now one of the most unequal among industrialized countries, and it was not always so. The inequality has continued to deepen and worsen across both Republican and Democratic administrations, so perhaps it isn't surprising that they have nothing to say about it. Neither one will attack the other because they are too vulnerable for the same attack in reverse. It's true not only about the inequality of income, but likewise about the inequality of wealth, which is greater than the inequality of income, which is bad enough. Neither will either candidate address the remarkable instability of U.S. capitalism. We lurch from one depression to the next, from one inflation to the next. We correct an inflation and worry about falling into a recession. That's what we're worried about now. And in recession, we're worried about stimulating an inflation, which often comes later. It's as if this instability, having been a problem for so long, having been unable to be overcome for so long, now has to be dealt with as if it weren't there. This is like people who live in a community where every day as they leave their home and go to work or go shopping, they have to step over the sleeping or maybe dead bodies of impoverished people that are in the doorway or in the gutter or on the side of the street. After a while, polls show people stop seeing them. They're there, but they've become routinized, normalized, and you don't see them. In our political system, the two major parties have conveniently stopped seeing instability because they have no solution to it. Therefore, they cannot admit it as a problem. It goes unspoken, unattended, undebated, and unresolved. Everyone worries now, everyone, that the artificial intelligence technical revolution that is underway will have a devastating effect on tens of millions of jobs, which will no longer need full-time or even part-time human labor the way they once did. What is going to happen to those jobs, to the individuals who used to fill them, to the families who depend on those individuals, to the communities that depend on the spending of those individuals and their families? What exactly are the two candidates going to do about this urgent problem crashing in on us like a threatening tsunami? And the answer is silence. They have no program. They wouldn't know quite how to put one out there. So the solution to that is to pretend that there's nothing that needs to be said. So they're silent. And now, in a way, the most important, which I've left for last. The overwhelming fact of the world economy right now, as we speak, is a radical reorganization of that economy. For most of the last century, the last 100 years, one economy has dominated the world, that of the United States. It was the center of the world economy. The one currency that was the global currency, the dollar. Nothing else, just the dollar. The euro had some importance. The yen did. Even recently, the Chinese currency. But the dollar was, and to some extent still remains, not as important as it once was, but still the United States' footprint on the world economy. But for most of the last century, the dollar was absolutely supreme, as good as gold or better. The United States, having nearly 4.5% of the world's population, accounted for much, much more of the world trade, exports and imports. Its dealings in oil shaped that market for everybody. Its political power unrivaled. The United States to this day maintains over 700 military bases around the world. No other country has anything remotely like that, and never had. The momentous change going on is that all of that is coming to an end. The United States' lone position, no threat at all economically for a century. Some of you I know still harbor the notion that the Soviet Union was some sort of competitor to the United States. Well, perhaps it had nuclear weapons, and so that was a bit of a military challenge, although they didn't have them the way the United States did. And perhaps politically and ideologically, early on after World War II, there was some challenge. But economically, never, not even a little bit. The GDP of Russia right now, and when I say right now, I mean the war in Ukraine, which is a war between the United States and Russia, waged by agreement to the last Ukrainian. Russia's GDP, about $1.5 trillion. The United States GDP, $23 trillion. No parity there. No threat from the tiny, tiny Russian economy. The United States is dominant, but that's all over. We are living through an unbelievable transformation because there is now a competitor, the People's Republic of China. Even if you include with the United States its allies, for example, the G7, the United States, Japan, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, the G7, and you compare them to China and its four major allies, the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. As I'm speaking to you, the GDP, the total output of goods and services of China and its four BRICS allies, is greater than the total GDP of the United States and its G7 allies. The world now is two enormous economic power blocks, not one. One is declining in terms of its relative wealth and power. The other one is rising. In the year 2020, they crossed. And ever since, the gap has grown as the one, China, becomes richer relative to the other one, the United States, which doesn't. Every country in the world is rearranging everything about its economy to adjust to a new international economic reality. Countries that used to look to New York and London are now wondering whether they can get a better deal on a loan or a purchase agreement or a sales agreement. Get a better deal in Beijing or New Delhi or Sao Paulo. Whoa! Money is being used in other currencies, not the dollar. Central banks are accumulating reserves, not in dollars, but in other currencies. The world is radically altering. And what do the two political parties of the United States, what are they saying to the American people is going to be the way we deal with this situation? Answer: silence. Nothing. We are pretending it isn't happening, like our unstable economy, like our grotesque inequality. We are and we need an election that supports this pretense. We can't have them discussing what is a taboo. And things, are happening. The United States has its naval fleet over there in China, threatening about Taiwan. Are we really going to try to stop the economic growth of China by military means? China has 1.4 billion people. We have 330 million. That's not even close. China has nuclear weapons. China isn't going to go away. And China's GDP, for those of you who want to know, is about $18 trillion. China is also enormous relative to Russia. Silence. And that's the most important silence. Why? Because the changed position of the United States is the single most important factor shaping what's happening in and to the United States. It's therefore going to be the cause, the ultimate shaper of many of the problems whoever wins this election will have to face as president of the United States. So silence is the worst and the most inexcusable of failures of responsibility on the part of these two major parties who exclude everybody else from participation. What do I mean? Well, let's see. The following wars were lost by the United States: Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, and now Ukraine. You know what that is? That's a sign of your declining economic power in the world in its military form. Here's another factoid. Once upon a time, a few years ago, central banks around the world kept 80% of the reserves. That's what's held by a central bank to prove that you can use its currency, because if you ever were to lose confidence in their currency, you can cash it in for the dollars that your central bank keeps for that purpose. Their reserves for their currency were 80-90% dollars, the rest in gold. Now it's around 40% in dollars. Whoa. Things are changing. The need for US dollars around the world is shrinking. More and more countries are working out deals to buy and sell from each other, not in the dollars that they used to use for decades to make those transactions, but now in their own currencies. The BRICS are trying to develop a composite currency they will use instead of the dollar. This phenomenon now has a name: the de-dollarization of the world economy. Well, that's a nice technical way of saying the decline of the American empire. Countries that used to borrow from the United States and pay heavy interest are getting loans instead from China at lower interest. That helps the Chinese. It helps those governments. It hurts the United States economy. I could go on, but I don't have enough time. And it's the conclusion that I want to draw that deserves your attention. The United States cannot continue as it has. It's not available, that option. The United States, those of you that are adults, especially those of you older like me, we, through no activity of our own, participated in the rise up of the American empire as it replaced the British Empire that was declining. The ride up in the history of every empire is much more agreeable than the ride down. Every empire has had them both. We are now in the process of discovering what it's like to be in an empire going down. And here's the single most important fact that neither of the two candidates dares tell you about. When an empire goes down, like the US now, the people at the top, the richest, those who run and own the corporations, the shares of stock that run them, They're in the best position in a declining empire to hold on to the wealth they've accumulated. They're in the best position to offload the costs of empire onto the middle and lower classes. And they do, which is why the decline of empire tends to produce, here we go now, growing tensions and animosities between the small group of rich who can hold on at the top and everybody else who discovers that their opportunities are shrinking, their income is pinched, their services are being cut back. No matter who wins the election, unless somebody has a plan for how to avoid this typical experience of a declining empire, and there are ways of doing that, but unless we admit it, we can't discuss them. We can't demand which of our candidates will do them. No, we just watch the decline, distracted by what these politicians want us to focus on, rather than what we need them to focus on. We need solutions. Are we really going to allow the burden of a declining capitalism, a declining U.S. empire, to be offloaded on the mass of people? And let me give you just a few examples of where the offloading will happen. And I'm going to then show you that the Europeans are in the same boat, and they're doing the same thing. They're just a little further ahead in some ways than we are, and therefore they show us our future. There's a debate going on, a serious one, about Social Security. Social Security, that's a service provided by the government that creates and funds a pension that says all Americans, after they do a lifetime of work in the factory, the office, the store, or at home, are entitled to a decent retirement. Their children are entitled not to have to carry the burdens of young people and children, and also the elderly generation. No, the government Social Security is going to take that burden, or at least a large part of it, off. Well, there's every effort to not do that. Social Security has not kept up with inflation. That's just a way of squeezing old people. We've been doing that. We haven't raised the minimum wage in America since 2009, even though prices have gone up every single year since then. That's a way of squeezing the poorest among us. That's a result of a changing world economy. Something has to give, and the folks at the top are damn sure it's not them, which means it's you and me, one way or another. Sure, they'll start with those who are the poorest or those who can't defend themselves. They'll cut back this program, that program. Yes, the Republicans will cut a lot quickly. The Democrats, they will cut less slowly. But notice, cutting, they both do, and they both have done. That minimum wage that hasn't been raised, that wasn't raised by Democrats in office or by Republicans in office. How interesting. The failure to keep Social Security going at least as high as inflation, that's a Democratic and a Republican achievement. So here's something I rarely do, a prediction. Here's my prediction. Whoever wins this race isn't going to change what I've been describing to you. The Chinese economy is going to continue to grow as it has, 2 or 3 times faster than the United States, something it has been doing for 30 to 40 years. The United States tried to stop it. Trump with his trade war, his tariff war. Biden, who continued both of them, mostly. Some of them even worse. He raised the tariff on Chinese electric vehicles to 100%, doubling the price, which is why you don't see electric vehicles from China on the streets of the United States. You go to Europe, you see them everywhere. The Europeans get to buy the best electric vehicles in the world right now at the cheapest price. They come from China. Americans have freedom of choice, but not that one, not that choice. Another choice you don't have. It isn't going to change. The tariff wars didn't change what happens in China, and the trade war didn't, and Trump didn't, and Biden didn't, and whether Kamala Harris wins or Trump wins, and they continue either the one policy or the other, isn't going to change much. We're going to continue what? We're going to continue the dividing of America into rich and poor extremely. And all the social and political problems of bitterness and rage and anger. No wonder millions of Americans want to make America great again. They want to go back to whatever we had before it started disappearing on us. Of course they do. Of course they're vulnerable to promises that those who make cannot keep. There is no going back. That's a fantasy. It's understandable because that fantasy arises in every society going through this kind of experience. We should have learned that by now. We should recognize that that's what happens. Here in the United States, we've begun to use a word that describes it in the past, fascism. Europe, which has had experiences with fascism many times, is a bit quicker and faster than we are on it. They have elections already showing fascism right out front clear where you can see it. I'm going to be talking about that in a few moments. Europe has lessons for us in that regard. But if you don't admit these issues, if you don't talk about them, if you don't debate them, if you don't force politicians to take positions on them, well, then you got nothing. And the politician who can actually get into office without ever dealing with these problems is probably not going to be inclined to deal with them after he or she gets elected. That seems to have been their road to success. Why change? So the problem will get worse. It festers. It continues to divide the country, to embitter the two divisions, and it'll have other consequences, ugly ones. The Republicans are going to have to wonder if they lose what lessons to draw. So will the Democrats. But they'll have tremendous problems to solve, whichever one wins. And here's a suspicion I have, which I'll make into a tentative prediction. If Kamala Harris wins, if the Democrats prevail, they will split. Because what they will be forced by the system to do in coping with a declining empire will so upset the labor union and social movement, the progressive part of that party, that it will not be able to tolerate being in the same political operation as those who actually accommodate to the declining empire by protecting corporations and the rich. And I predicted because of what happened in Europe. And what happened in Europe is an advance over what happened here. And I'm going to go through it now briefly to draw the lessons that both parts of the world are showing us. I'll begin with Great Britain. Great Britain is an empire that is even further down than the American because it started its decline earlier. In fact, the rise of the American empire was part of the decline of the British, of which the U.S. was once a small colony. Britain was governed for most of the last 20 years by the Conservative Party, the British equivalent of the Republicans in the United States. They're the ones that pushed through Brexit, blaming the decline of the British Empire on Europeans. That's right up there with the Americans blaming the decline of the American empire on the poorest immigrants from Central America. That's nonsense. That's not just scapegoating, but it's nonsensical scapegoating. A country of 330 million people that admits 10, maybe even 15 million poorest of the poor immigrants isn't thereby transformed by those 10 to 15 million who haven't the power to transform a 330 million person economy. That's silly. But if people are desperate, they need an explanation. The British were desperate. Their declining empire had been going on longer, much longer than the U.S. Their working class was decimated, bitter, angry. So they voted for conservatives. They have a working class party in England called the Labour Party. They voted for conservatives, and they got excited about blaming Europe and saying we can get away from Europe, we can secede from Europe. They called it Brexit, breaking away, an exit, a British exit from Europe, Brexit. Did that solve the problem? Of course not. Did the condition of the working class in England get better? It got worse. When you destroy a scapegoat, you discover that that's what it was. A scapegoat doesn't solve your problems because it wasn't your problem. So the British a few weeks ago, finally figuring this out after whatever it was, 15 years of conservative government, voted in the Labour Party. That's roughly the equivalent of the Democratic Party in this country, of the centrist part, so-called, of the Democratic Party. And Mr. Starmer, the new prime minister, what is he doing now that he's in government? And it's only now a few weeks. Well, he's already telling us that his upcoming budget will be, get ready now, reducing fuel assistance to the poor in Britain and increasing outlays for Ukraine's war. Now, folks, that's exactly the kind of thing the conservatives have been doing. It's what the people in England voted against. And here he is, Mr. Labour leader, doing it again. Why? Because he's got to do what the ruling class in Britain demands. Protect our wealth. Don't tax it away. Don't follow policies that impinge on our wealth to help people in need. You know why people in England need fuel assistance? Because they don't buy cheap oil and gas from Russia anymore. They have to pay much, much more to get liquefied natural gas from the United States or from other parts of the world. The policy of supporting the Ukraine war is not only taking their cash, but bankrupting them by charging them for the fuel without which they cannot heat their homes, which in Britain you need to do. You're offloading the costs of decline onto the middle and the poor. Let's turn next to France. France gives us a variation on this lesson. They too have had a conservative government for a while now, under Mr. Macron. He too has hit them with a variety of taxes, efforts to cut pensions for old people, and other things which, if you think about it, are all efforts to offload the cost of a declining French empire onto the French older working class, middle class, and poor. And he too has been pumping money into Ukraine, among other things. So they voted him out. They had a general election, and his party came in third. And you know who won? A party that is the coming together of four left-wing parties. The New Popular Front, it called itself, and it ran in that national election. And it ended up number one. It got more votes than the party of the prime minister. And this unified New Popular Front, composed of four smaller parties, which, by the way, included the French Communist Party, the French Socialist Party, the French Green Party, and the biggest of all, France Unbowed, La France Insoumise, a real leftist party, comes in number one. And what has Mr. Macron done? He has decided, and here is a clue to what we are facing. He's decided that it's no longer convenient to follow democratic norms. In France, as in many countries, the party that gets the most votes and the most seats in the parliament gets the right to try to form a government. It'll have to do it with others because they don't have an absolute majority. But they are to be invited to try to find the votes to put together a government. Would be called a coalition government. That's how it works. Mr. Macron won't do it, won't invite the left-wing party to do what would normally be done. The left-wing party came up with a young woman who would be the next prime minister to try to form a government, which they think they can do. No, he said, I won't. And now it's emerging, literally today as I prepared for this talk, that he's working with the Le Pen movement. That's the French fascist movement, just so everyone understands. That Mr. Macron and his allies swore they would never work with. I guess if it comes to holding back anything left-wing, all bets are off. Mr. Macron is showing us that when democratic procedures get a result you don't like, you don't have to abide by democracy anymore. And believe me, the French watch what the English do, the English watch what the Germans do, the Germans watch what the Americans do, and the Americans watch all of them. This idea that democracy doesn't have to worry about cutting deals with fascists so long as they're keeping socialists away could give you a clue as to what might happen here if anything similar were to happen. And then there were the elections literally a few weeks ago in the eastern part of Germany. And there, two interesting things happened. Number one, an explicitly fascist party in Germany, let's remember the home of Nazism and Adolf Hitler, came in first, the fascist party, in those regional elections in the eastern part of Germany. But almost as impressive was the new enormous vote, really remarkable, for Sahra Wagenknecht. a left-wing Marxist German politician whose new party coming out of the Die Linke party, also a left-wing party in Germany. And if you put together Sahra Wagenknecht's vote and the Die Linke vote, then the left is as impressive a vote getter in that election as the fascists. The middle is falling apart. The left is rising and the fascists are rising. And the fascists are saying to the powerful leader like Macron, you can't lead without us. And you better cut a deal with us because they're about to beat you from the left. That's exactly the story of Germany and Hitler. It's a story when Hitler comes to power, he says to the German ruling class, the industrialists, the communists and the socialists are coming. They already have half the vote of this country, which they did in 1932. You better make a deal with me to hold them back. Otherwise, it's over. And they made the deal. And the rest is the history of Nazism. Not to talk about this, not to understand what's going on, not to take a position on these elections, not to take a position on the rise of fascism is an extraordinary activity of the United States going into this election. We've come to the end of today's program. I want to leave you with a provocation. We are in tumultuous times. There will be an understanding sooner or later of what we've been talking about. I hope this talk brings it sooner. The changes that are going on are fundamental and radical. They need policy responses democratically arrived at. The elections now are everything but that, except in those few places where the politicians who have a memory, who understand the history, force these things on. We don't have that here. So it's left to those of us outside to try to do it, which is what I tried to do today. Thank you for your attention. Let me remind you again, visit our website, democracyatwork.info, to find out both about the classes in economic analysis, understanding capitalism, that I will be teaching starting September 30th, and the book that we will be using in those classes, Understanding Capitalism. You can get all of the information on both of those issues at our website. Thank you again, and I look forward to speaking with you again in 2 months.